A few words relating to the history of criminal justice in Britain are as resonant as Dartmoor, with what historians Alana Barton and Alison Brown describe as, quote, its unique capacity to invoke an idealized and even mythical representation of all prisons. What the example of Dartmoor appears to confirm is that Victorian incarceration, and perhaps incarceration more generally, is an unchanging story of forbidding fortress-like architecture, brutal prison regime, and dangerous, violent offenders. Thus, to quote again Barton and Brown, quote, in the popular imagination, Dartmoor is at once menacing, thrilling, and also paradoxically comfortable in that it appears to confirm what we already know to be true or would like to be true about prisons and those who are incarcerated. A prison less lost, to take my title again, might be hard to imagine, even if, as will have been clear from the tone of these remarks, much of what we think we know about Dartmoor turns out to be at best partial truth. However, even that partial truth turns out to be of little assistance in the present case, for it's founded on the assumption that the prison served uniquely to incarcerate convicts. Dartmoor Prison would indeed perform this function for many decades, beginning with the arrival of its first male convicts at the end of 1850. Yet Dartmoor was built 45 years earlier than this, in 1805. The original prison was in many respects strikingly different from the one we now associate with the site, different in its design, different in its regime, and imprisoning within its walls very different kinds of inmates. It is this earlier prison which is the subject of today's paper, and it's a prison, I shall argue, that has indeed been lost, both to specialists of the French and Anglo-American wars of the period, and also to criminal justice historians. Although by 1850, the principle of locking up prisoners for prolonged periods in penal establishments run by central government was well established, this was not true in 1805. In fact, the only central government involvement in the punishment of criminals at that date was through the application of the death penalty, and for serious criminals who were spared the rope, the organisation of their exile to the Australian penal colony of Botany Bay, founded in 1788. That's not to say there were no prisons in Britain at this date. There existed a motley assortment of houses of correction, bridewells, jails, prisons, and lockups of various kinds and sizes, financed and run by local government. The population of such local prisons, as they were known, was equally motley, comprised of debtors, petty criminals, and vagrants, of the convicted and the yet to be tried, plus, on occasion, convicts awaiting transportation to Australia or execution on the scaffold. Few, with the possible exception of debtors, could expect to spend more than a few weeks or a few months behind bars before being released, tried, or punished elsewhere. Conditions were equally varied. On paper, there was a legislative framework setting out minimum standards for prisons in England and Wales, but those standards were more often honoured in the breach than in the observance, as prison reformer John Howard discovered when he undertook his pioneering survey of the country's penal establishments in the early 1770s, published in 1777 as The State of the Prisons. Howard's relentless catalogue of carceral neglect and misery did serve to galvanise some local magistrates and elected officials in the 1780s and 90s into building new prisons or modifying existing ones. But central government remained largely indifferent to the reformers' emphasis on individual cells, the classification of different categories of inmates, and improved standards of cleanliness and order. There was, however, one issue linked to prisons that did exercise government ministers in the early 1800s, but it had nothing to do with crime or criminals, because we're talking about the unprecedented increase in the number of prisoners of war in Britain. One recent estimate puts the total number of French prisoners held by the British during the period 1803 to 14 at 150,000. To this should be added between 17 and 20,000 Americans captured during the War of 1812. Annual totals of prisoners were lower than this, of course, but they reveal the extent to which the system had to expand since the mid-18th century. In 1761, during the 7 Years' War, 20,000 prisoners of war were held captive in Britain. By 1813, the figure was more than 3 times higher at 72,000. At the beginning of the French wars in 1793, there had been every expectation that the war with revolutionary France would be over quickly, and that the customary exchange of prisoners, which was a staple of 18th century warfare, would in any case soon relieve pressure on existing facilities. Both of these assumptions would turn out to be unfounded, though the implications of that miscalculation took some time to inform policy at the Admiralty's Transport Office, which was the government department charged with the management of the country's prisoners of war. In the short term, the solutions adopted by the Transport Office for dealing with foreign combatants were equally ad hoc, placing prisoners in local prisons with spare capacity, converting existing military buildings for prisoner use, and perhaps the most well-known expedient of all, retrofitting decommissioned naval warships for a new lease of life as immobile floating prison vessels known as hulks. By 1805, the unrelenting pressure of numbers, partly due to the breakdown in negotiations on prisoner exchanges with France, coupled with a growing recognition that the conflict could go on for many years, had forced a change of direction amongst Admiralty planners. The first concrete result of that change of direction would be a surprising one. An ambitious plan to construct a prison for 5,000 inmates, which, just to give you a comparison, was more than 10 times the capacity of the biggest criminal prison at that time. A prison which would incorporate many of the latest ideas of prison design and management. More surprising still, perhaps, was that this new prison would be built in one of the remotest and bleakest corners of the British Isles, on Dartmoor in Devon. Both scholarly and popular interest in Dartmoor prison has been largely confined to the period after its conversion into a convict prison in 1850. The circumstances surrounding its foundation 45 years earlier and its 11-year history as a war prison have, in contrast, been the object of virtually no detailed study by historians. Part of the problem, as historian Renaud Morieux has recently argued, is that scholarly interest in 18th and early 19th century prison design and penal reform on the one hand, and the study of the French wars and the War of 1812 on the other, have tended up until now to run on parallel historiographical tracks, leaving the interactions between the two largely unexplored. It was this really that brought me to this project, the idea of considering these two aspects together, which I decided would be the way of allowing me to hopefully appreciate the full significance of Dartmoor Prison during these years, not only in terms of government policy and international relations, but also crucially in terms of the daily life of the various multinational, multilingual, multi-ethnic prison communities, both prisoners and personnel, military and civilian, living and dying on the site between 1805 and 1816. The research for this project involved consulting archives, sources from the government and diplomatic records of the UK, the USA, and France, Fortunately, the fieldwork was completed just before those kinds of journeys became impossible. I was trying to tap into the rich corpus of surviving personal letters, diaries, and accounts written by Dartmoor prisoners of war and visitors of different nationalities. A number of French and US accounts were published in subsequent decades, but much of this material remains in manuscript form, held in local repositories in the 3 countries, and had hitherto received little attention from historians. In today's talk, I shall begin in part 1 by examining the background to the decision to build the prison on Dartmoor. Then I shall look at the design that was chosen, and then in the 2 final parts, look at aspects of the framework of rules put in place at Dartmoor by the Transport Office. Firstly, the disciplinary and punishment regime at the prison, and finally, some unexpected, if limited, spaces for prisoner agency. In July 1805, so coming into this first part on the background to the construction of the prison, it takes us to the next slide. The future architect of Dartmoor Prison, this is him here, Daniel Asher Alexander, visited the site for the first time, accompanied by a member of the Transport Board and local landowner, Sir Thomas Tyrwhitt. In a letter written later that month, Alexander informed the board, and this is what we've got in a little quotation on the right here, that all was required, that the new prisons situation includes in it all that is required, as far as Dartmoor can do, for the construction of a prison, for the health and safe custody of prisoners, and for the victualling of the prisoners and guard. Alexander submitted detailed plans and costing estimates for the new project in September 1805, and work on the 15-acre site began the following March on land leased from the Prince of Wales. Tyrwhitt laid the foundation stone. It's worth pausing perhaps for a moment to examine Alexander's comments of July 1805, putting to one side his ominous parenthesis there. The site chosen, it was claimed, offered all that was required for the construction of a prison, for the prisoner's health and safe custody, and for the provisioning or victualling of both inmates and guards. The phrase, all that is required, seems to me to raise the question of what was required or what was considered to be required to build a prison for 5,000 prisoners of war. There was clearly no shortage of building materials in the form of local granite. Water, predictably, if any of you who know the region will know that water was not a problem on Dartmoor. And there was also plentiful peat for fuel. These were important considerations, as was the easy availability of land at nominal cost from the Duchy of Cornwall, which was the owner of the land in the region. Safe custody was also a key concern, as might be expected. In this respect, Dartmoor presented a number of purported advantages. Whereas on the hulks, it had been discovered that prisoners could literally smash their way to freedom by breaking through rotting decks and bulkheads. The granite walls of the new prison would theoretically be less vulnerable, and the prison's design was intended to make escape next to impossible. And if any of Dartmoor's prisoners did manage to break out of this military fortress, they would be faced with some of the most inhospitable terrain Britain had to offer. It was also reasoned that unlike the hulks, which were moored at Portsmouth, Chatham, and nearby Plymouth, the prison would be at a safe distance from sensitive naval installations and centres of population. At the same time, the port of Plymouth, which was 17 miles away from the prison, was close enough for prisoners to be shipped in and out by sea, and if the need arose, The garrison could also provide military reinforcements to deal with major outbreaks of disorder or a mass breakout at the prison. There were also, as might be expected, a certain number of drawbacks in choosing to build and run a prison the size of a small town in the middle of a sparsely populated moor, where, as the prison's medical officer later conceded, the cold during the winter months was, quote, almost too intense to support animal life, unquote. Labour for construction was hard to find locally, and the remote location, coupled with the region's severe weather conditions, meant not only repeated delays to building work, but also posed considerable logistical problems when it came to provisioning the prison with food and other supplies once it was in operation. Both Alexander and the Admiralty made light of these difficulties and indeed argued that Dartmoor's testing climate offered positive health benefits to the prisoners. Others, though, were less sanguine. Significantly, the Transport Office's own medical inspector, Dr. Andrew Baird, was one of the skeptics. A frequent visitor at the prison, Baird later admitted with evident understatement that, quote, he should consider very much before recommending Dartmoor on health grounds, adding that rain and very thick mists shrouded the site for 9 months of the year. Baird warned his superiors repeatedly that the harsh living conditions for Dartmoor prisoners, with up to 1,500 confined cheek by jowl in each of the prison's poorly ventilated, unheated accommodation blocks, carried major health risks. Many inmates shared his concerns and were convinced, as one French prisoner put it, that this God-forsaken corner of England had been deliberately chosen by the Admiralty as part and parcel of the barbarities, as he put it, deliberately inflicted by the British with odious refinement on the prison's inmates. From this point of view, the inscription taken from Virgil, which was carved into the prison's entrance arch, Parcere Subjectis, or spare or pity or mercy the vanquished. From this perspective, this inscription could be seen as a cruel irony or maybe perhaps a deliberate joke made at the expense of the hapless captives. There is no evidence that the Admiralty planners had a penchant for black humor, but the Transport Board did seriously underestimate the challenges involved in building and running a war prison on Dartmoor. And the choices made, both with regard to design and management, would have serious and indeed sometimes fatal consequences for the more than 20,000 prisoners held captive within its walls between 1809 and 1816. So I'd like to turn now to the second part on the design of the prison. As noted above, innovation in prison design and management had hitherto been the result of local initiatives driven by reforming magistrates, elected officials, or county grandees, rather than the work of central government. Yet at Dartmoor, the Admiralty would break with this tradition, and the commission awarded to Daniel Alexander in 1805 would be for a fashionable radial design, which we can see in the next slide. We can zoom in a little bit. Whose 5 rectangular accommodation blocks, you can see them around the top there, known as prisons, rather confusingly, fanned out at 45 degree angles from a central vantage point, like the spokes of a wheel. This was ostensibly to maximize surveillance or inspection, as it was termed in the language of the period, with reformers favouring a central administrative hub staffed by governor and guards, affording a panoramic view over the inmates. Alexander had settled on this radial design within a few weeks of that first visit to Dartmoor in July 1805, explaining to the Transport Office, this is the next slide, that he would be submitting plans for a prison on a kind of concentric plan with a guardhouse in the centre, which will admit of the several buildings containing the prisoners in the courtyards, in which they will walk in the form of radii, so as to be always under the inspection of the guard in the centre, to consist of 2 or 3 stories. This is indeed the design of the prison that would be built at Dartmoor, as a modern aerial view of the prison reveals. You can still make out that basic plan of Alexander's, but there'll be one striking exception. Alexander's radii would indeed be present in the form of prisoner accommodation blocks. We see them rather more clearly in this modern architectural design based on Alexander's plans. So 5 to begin with, but 2 others were later added. But these 5 blocks would radiate around an empty space. In other words, there'd be nothing in the middle. At some point before the final plans were approved in September 1805, Alexander was told to remove the central guardhouse, it having been decided that it would be imprudent to place it in the midst of 5,000 enemy prisoners. But rather than rethinking the whole design, now that its sort of raison d'etre was effectively scrapped, the decision was made to retain the original design, whereas the guardhouses were moved to the perimeter of the prison. The governor's residence also moved to the periphery of the site at the bottom there. Also on that periphery was placed the first of 2 boundary walls equipped with a series of platforms, or bastions as Alexander called them, offering the soldiers of the 500-strong prison garrison a clear line of sight and potentially a clear line of fire over the large semicircular area occupied by the 5 radiating prisons. The final plan for Dartmoor was thus a hybrid one, taking certain elements from the latest design ideas for criminal prisons and bolting onto it features conceived specifically for the incarceration of prisoners of war. In this limited sense, then, the design for Dartmoor affords an illustration of what has been termed a military fortress turned inside out, with the prison's firepower directed not outwards, as in a conventional military fortress or castle, but inwards towards an internal enemy. So moving on now to my third part on the regime put in place at Dartmoor. The first prisoners arrived on the 22nd of May 1809, nearly 18 months behind schedule, I should add perhaps. Within a week, more than 2,000 French soldiers and sailors had trudged the 17 miles on foot from Dartmoor to the prison, and by the end of September, the prison population had risen to 6,000, already 1,000 more than had originally been planned for. Many of those 6,000 would remain there until the peace of 1814, though about a third would not. Some were exchanged or transferred, a few escaped, and 14%, that's 1 in 7, died. Many of them carried away during an epidemic of typhus that swept through the prison during the winter of 1809 to 10. Mortality rates would be lower for later cohorts of French and American prisoners, 11 and 4% respectively. But death and illness remained a constant backdrop to life at the prison, with epidemic diseases like measles and smallpox continuing to stalk the prison compound. How does this grim reality fit with the official narrative, such as that offered in a sympathetic account of the prison published in Ackermann's repository in September 1810? It was stated confidently, this is the quotation we have here, "Here, under the humane arrangement and control of the Transport Board, ably seconded by the resident agent or governor, Isaac Cotgrave, Esquire, an old post captain, every comfort is administered to alleviate the prisoner's unhappy lot as far as the circumstances will allow. Unbiased by motives foreign to their duty and the innate liberality and feeling of their hearts, these gentlemen, some of whom are well acquainted with French prisons and have personally experienced what they are, pursue an undeviating system of philanthropy, honorable to themselves and beneficial to the object of their care and exertions." And I can't help thinking that this article was probably published with Transport Board seal of approval before it was handed in. The Transport Board clearly believed that the regime provided at Dartmoor was consistent with the level of comfort appropriate for prisoners of war. Indeed, they regularly pointed out that it was superior to the minimum standard required and to that provided by their enemies, though the latter vigorously contested that claim. From the perspective of the Transport Board chairman's desk in Whitehall, comfort meant clear rules consistently applied. It meant a meticulously designed table of rations, providing food in sufficient but not too sufficient quantities, and the regular but not too regular supply of clothes and bedding. And it meant an orderly and secure physical environment from which it was impossible, or at least very difficult, to escape, which in turn, if you follow this logic, entailed dissuasively harsh punishments for those who challenged those rules or threatened the security of the prison. Punishment at Dartmoor generally took the form of 1 or 2 weeks of solitary confinement on reduced rations spent in the prison's cachot. The French word was used, cachot, or sometimes it was called a black hole, a small windowless building set apart from the rest of the prison. In the case of attempted damage to prison property or escape, the punishment might be a collective one, placing the 1,500 inmates of a single prison block on reduced rations, ostensibly to reimburse the cost of damage or the resources mobilized to pursue an escaping prisoner. And it's interesting that in the case of a successful escape, those left behind would have to pay the bill, effectively. More serious offences involving violence, sedition, or forgery, which was taken very seriously by the authorities, could result in removal to the hulks in Plymouth, or in rare cases, a criminal trial at the assize courts in Exeter. In some cases then, the disciplinary regime at Dartmoor in these years resembled that found in the country's criminal prisons, notably its reliance on solitary confinement and dietary privation. That being said, several structural aspects of the regime put in place in prisoner of war prisons like Dartmoor served to aggravate its impact. Quite clearly in the aggravating category was that policy of administering collective cuts in food rations to whole swathes of prisoners as a form of punishment. When combined with further privation resulting from the endemic corruption and dishonesty surrounding the supply of food and other clothes and other supplies to the war prisons by private contractors, the erratic provision of erratic provision of clothing and bedding, not to mention the puzzling decision to leave the prison blocks unheated, even during Dartmoor's Siberian winter. The cumulative effect on prisoners' health could be devastating, particularly when placed alongside what we know is the profound psychological impact of long-term incarceration. But if the regime at Dartmoor prison and thus the daily lives of its prisoners resembled in some respects that of a criminal prison of the same period, there were also some surprising departures. And it is to these departures or these aspects that I intend to turn for this last part of the paper. I call this part, by the way, the paradox of Dartmoor prison, which is a quotation from an American historian called Reginald Horseman. The paradox that Horseman is referring to here is the fact that alongside the restrictive and punitive disciplinary regime that I've just described, one which resulted in considerable hardship and death, there were also significant spaces for prisoner agency, even though, as will be seen, that space also created inequalities within the carceral population, both of material conditions and of power. This paradox stems from the fact that, like its design, the regime put in place at Dartmoor by the Transport Office was a hybrid one, with one foot in conventional early 19th century penal practice and the other in a different, more contractual conception of incarceration, one which blended prisoner rights and obligations. Thus, notwithstanding the disciplinary regime of solitary confinement, cuts in rations, roll calls, searches, lockdowns, which of course familiar to all carceral regimes of this period, Dartmoor's inmates could generally choose in which prison building they lived, with whom they ate or messed in the language of the time, and indeed how they spent a considerable portion of their time. These choices all came with caveats and indeed could be withdrawn as an additional form of collective punishment by the authorities, but nonetheless, they offered prisoners a degree of control over their everyday lives, which was totally alien to the inmates of criminal prisons. In addition, and in plain contradiction with the latest thinking on criminal prison management, this is the next slide, a daily market, this shows you where it was, a daily market was held within the prison walls, in which local farmers and tradespeople from the surrounding area came to sell food, clothing, and other items to prisoners. And those tradespeople and farmers and other visitors bought from prisoners craft and artwork, including those highly intricate bonework ships. Probably many of you have seen those already. Prisoners also set up shops, as they were known, in the prison compound, selling food and drink, including alcohol, which was officially banned but unofficially tolerated, and other items to their fellow prisoners. The ability to purchase these goods, whether in the public market or at the prisoner shops, along with a wide range of other services on offer from prisoners, such as having one's laundry washed, borrowing library books, taking lessons in foreign languages or fencing, attending a play. All of these things depended on access to money. There was in fact plenty of money at Dartmoor, particularly during the later years of the prison's existence, when a significant number of American prisoners were able to draw on back pay and prize money from their time serving in the Royal Navy. So these, of course, people who served first as British sailors on British ships. Then when the War of 1812 started, they were given the choice of either continuing to serve on their ships, but potentially firing on Americans or becoming prisoners of war. And most chose the latter option. Some prisoners, both French and American, although there's not a great deal of information about this, also had access to private funds sent to them by friends or relatives. For most inmates, however, the reality of life at Dartmoor prison in these years was one of hardship, of overcrowding, gnawing hunger, biting cold, disease, and for some, death. A further striking difference between the prisoner of war prisons and the criminal prisons was the existence of elected prisoner committees, or conseils for the French prisoners, and that there will be one of these in each of the Dartmoor prison blocks or prisons. These were officially recognized by the prison authorities and indeed were directly involved in the preparation and distribution of the official food rations. And the committees even had the power, at least on paper, to reject supplies which were judged as substandard, although this practice didn't quite work out that way very often in practice. The prisoner committees also enforced their own system of unofficial justice, a parallel framework existing alongside the official prison rule book, complete with jury trials and floggings for the most serious infringements. Once again, these punishments were generally tolerated by the prison authorities, though there were occasions, a particularly savage flogging, for example, or in cases of so-called traitors being forcibly tattooed, when the authorities attempted to intervene with varying degrees of success. Interestingly, not all of these unofficial punishments were sanctioned by the prisoner committees, and there appear in both the French and the US prisoner communities to have been groups of prisoners operating outside the control of the committee system. There was a group of French prisoners known as Romans, and a US group nicknamed the Rough Allies, engaged in their own brand of rough justice, including the forcible tattooing I mentioned earlier, as well as various forms of disorder involving prison guards and in petty theft at the market and in prison kitchens. Many of the surviving captivity narratives which have come down to us choose to distance themselves from the actions of the Romans and the Rough Allies, but in reality, some of the actions of these marginal groups, notably when it involved a challenge to the authority of the British captors, earned them the grudging respect and admiration of their fellow prisoners. The social dynamics of life at the prison were thus highly complex and fluctuating. Moving on then to some words of conclusion. Dartmoor prison was built to accommodate prisoners of war, yet in many key respects, both its design and regime resembled the criminal prisons of the period. Ironically, despite the decision to commission a design from Daniel Alexander inspired by the fashionable radial plan, conditions in the various warehouse-like prisons, which extended out from that now empty central point, were more akin, in fact, to the communal wards of 18th century prisons, those conditions condemned by John Howard in the 1770s, than they were to the prisons favoured by the new generation of reformers with their individual cells and intricate classification of different types of offender. To begin with, at least, there was no classification of any kind at Dartmoor, although officers were accommodated for a time in a separate building until numbers made it impossible to continue that. And prisoners, again to begin with, were allowed to circulate freely during the daytime within the 5-acre semicircular compound that we saw earlier. As prisoner numbers increased and official nervousness about a possible mass breakout or riot also increased, and this nervousness seemed to have increased exponentially with the arrival of the Americans in 1813 in the prison. After that point, three, we can see them in the next slide, three internal partition walls were added. And also some other security measures were increased. There were more soldiers at the garrison, more sentry boxes were built, and so on. At the end of the day, however, with just a few dozen prison staff and a few hundred poorly trained militia soldiers responsible for guarding up to 8,000 prisoners at one time, there were good pragmatic reasons to delegate key aspects of prison management to the inmates themselves. There is even a suggestion that a decision to segregate the US prisoners of color in February 1814 emanated from the inmates themselves. And I'm going to be talking about that in a second paper at Paris Diderot, the Greer seminar in May, but I can say a little bit about it in the questions if anyone's interested. The result, I have stressed, was a hybrid regime combining elements of a traditional punitive carceral framework with a more contractual conception specific to the confinement of prisoners of war, one in which, on paper at least, prisoner rights and obligations were acknowledged and complaints addressed. These two competing and arguably contradictory aspects of the regime at Dartmoor created considerable instability and tension within the prison community. And in the context of these official fears of large-scale disorder and mass breakout on the one hand, and a growing prisoner resentment and hostility to certain aspects of the carceral regime on the other, the risk of disorder and perhaps of bloodshed was a constant one. On one occasion in April 1815, militia guards opened fire on US prisoners, both from the market square and from Alexander's wall top bastions. And I've got one contemporary print here which shows those particular events. This is what became known as the Dartmoor massacre, in which 9 prisoners were killed and a further 60 were seriously injured. Dartmoor War Prison closed in February 1816 and lay abandoned for 30 years. Local poet and author Rachel Evans visited the site at the end of that period in 1845 and recorded what she saw. The prison itself was largely a decaying shell, but Evans was able to make out a number of messages in French scrawled on the wall of one of the clerk's offices, and was also shown a door and a stretch of wall near the former market square, which still bore the pockmarks of musket fire from April 1815, as we see here. So you can see the bastions, the circled areas at the top there. So this sort of French graffiti and the pockmarks on the walls were two traces of the prison's history, still etched into the very fabric of the prison nearly 30 years after the last inmates of Dartmoor had left. A fitting symbol, perhaps, both of the agency of those detained at Dartmoor, but also of the deadly limits of that agency. Thank you.